Charles Bronson was the one man who made Clint Eastwood cautious. Not angry, not jealous, not competitive in the typical sense. Cautious. It was a feeling Eastwood rarely experienced and never admitted to publicly. But decades after their paths had crossed in Hollywood's most turbulent era, he finally gave a name to that feeling. In a moment of uncharacteristic candor, Eastwood didn't call Bronson a peer, a rival, or even an acquaintance. He defined him with a single, loaded sentence: "He was the only man I never underestimated." That wasn't a compliment offered lightly. It was an admission. A recognition of a truth that existed in the silent space between two men who built legends on the power of not speaking. This is the story of why two of Hollywood's most formidable presences deliberately avoided each other for their entire careers, not out of pettiness, but out of a profound and unsettling mutual understanding. To grasp the gravity of Eastwood's statement, you must first understand the raw material that formed Charles Bronson. He did not emerge from acting schools or theatrical families. He was forged in darkness. Born into a Lithuanian-American coal mining family in Pennsylvania, Bronson's childhood was not a prelude to fame, it was a struggle for basic survival. By the age of 10, he was working alongside his father, extracting coal from the earth. The world was not a stage but a tomb of dust and echoing silence, where a man's worth was measured by endurance, not expression. There was no room for pretense, no audience for drama. You worked, you endured, or you broke. This environment did not create an actor. It created a man for whom stillness was not a choice but a fundamental condition. When he later stood before a camera, his intensity was not a performance. It was a remnant. He wasn't portraying toughness, he was exhibiting the accumulated residue of a life where toughness was the minimum requirement for existence. His silence was not mysterious, it was authentic. Clint Eastwood's origin, while less physically brutal, was cut from a similar cloth of instability. Growing up during the Great Depression, his family moved constantly, chasing work and fleeing poverty. This nomadic existence taught a young Eastwood that security was an illusion and control was something you built for yourself, piece by silent piece. He learned the power of economy, of movement, of speech, of emotion. His iconic screen persona, the squint, the measured delivery, the lethal calm, was not an invention but a refinement. He weaponized restraint. He turned less into more, understanding that an audience would project their own fears onto his quiet. But there was a crucial distinction between the two men. Eastwood employed silence. It was a directorial choice, a tool in his artistic kit. Bronson inhabited silence. It was the air he breathed. One was a masterful tactic, the other was an immutable state of being. And in that subtle difference lay the root of their unspoken standoff. When their careers ascended in the late 1960s and 70s, placing them at the pinnacle of a new, grittier American cinema, the Hollywood machine logically wanted to combine these forces. The idea was box office alchemy, Eastwood and Bronson together in one film. The ultimate pairing of stoic power. Scripts were written, westerns where they'd be grizzled partners, crime thrillers where they'd be adversaries, war films where they'd be fellow soldiers. The projects were pitched, the deals were floated, and every single one disintegrated before reaching production. Official reasons cited scheduling conflicts or creative differences, the standard Hollywood euphemisms. But the truth was simpler and more profound. Both men consistently, independently, said no. They refused not out of animosity, but out of a shared, instinctual understanding of a dangerous truth. On screen, their power derived from an absolute, unquestionable dominance of the frame. Audiences didn't watch Bronson in Death Wish or Eastwood in Dirty Harry and wonder about the character's motivation. They simply accepted the raw, gravitational force of the man himself. Putting two such forces in the same cinematic orbit wouldn't create synergy, it would create a silent, debilitating tension. The audience would inevitably play a comparison game on a visceral level. Who holds the screen more completely? Whose silence feels more dangerous? Whose pain seems more earned? It would become a subconscious test, and neither man was willing to be the one who blinked. To share the frame would be to risk the very myth of indivisible strength they had each spent a lifetime cultivating. Their few documented interactions in real life confirmed this dynamic. At industry events, they were known to acknowledge each other with a mere nod, a brief meeting of eyes across a crowded room before retreating to their respective orbits. There were no heated arguments, no competitive boasts. Instead, there was a palpable, respectful distance, like two sovereign powers maintaining a carefully monitored border. Crew members who observed them noted a strange quality in the air when both were present, not hostility, but a hyper-awareness. It was the mutual recognition of a shared condition. They saw in each other a reflection of a specific type of man, one who had converted survival into persona, who had built an armor so effective it eventually fused with the skin. This avoidance was the highest form of professional respect. Eastwood, the meticulous architect of his own image, recognized in Bronson something he could not architect, an untamed, unrehearsed authenticity born of genuine hardship. Bronson's toughness wasn't layered on, it was foundational. To Eastwood, a man who controlled every aspect of his performance, this represented a kind of terrifying purity. It was dangerous not in a physical sense, but in an existential one. Bronson was a living reminder of what lay at the core of the archetype Eastwood so carefully curated, the unadorned, unforgiving reality of a man shaped by breakage. Collaborating would have forced that reality into the light. The closest they ever came was a proposed Western in the mid-1970s, a serious project with a respected director. They were to play aging gunslingers, former partners reunited. Eastwood initially agreed, but upon learning Bronson was attached, he withdrew after days of contemplation. Bronson, when his agent mentioned Eastwood's potential involvement, simply shook his head and said, "Won't work." The project died. Years later, explaining his refusal, Eastwood offered a cryptic insight: sometimes the best performances are the ones you don't give. He wasn't talking about the role. He was talking about the peril of dismantling the myth for a mere film. As they aged, their careers diverged, revealing the inner cost of their exteriors. Eastwood transitioned into directing, using his later films like Unforgiven and Gran Torino to deconstruct the very myth of the hardened, violent man he helped create. These films are meditations on the loneliness, regret, and heavy toll of a life lived behind emotional armor. They are, in a sense, a quiet interrogation of the Bronson question: what is the price of surviving into toughness? Bronson, meanwhile, continued working, the intensity in his eyes never dimming, but a deep weariness settling into the lines of his face. He carried the weight visibly. When he passed away in 2003, Eastwood offered no public eulogy, no grand Hollywood tribute. His silence was itself a statement. Privately, those close to him said he was deeply affected. Bronson's death meant the departure of the only other man who truly understood the specific gravity of the persona they both carried, the last witness to a transformation that could not be undone. It was only later, in an intimate setting, when Bronson's name arose, that Eastwood finally articulated the core of their dynamic. He elaborated on his famous line, explaining, "People think toughness is about not breaking. But that's not it. Real toughness is about what you do after you've already been broken." He spoke of Bronson's childhood in the mines, his late-blooming stardom, the sheer weight of the survival he brought to every role. "He didn't act," Eastwood concluded. "He just showed you what survival looks like." Then he revealed the ultimate truth behind their lifelong professional distance. "If we'd worked together, the audience would have seen too much. They would have seen what we both knew but never said. That all of it, the toughness, the silence, the control, all of it comes from fear. Fear that if you let the armor down, you won't be able to put it back up." Their refusal to collaborate was, in the end, an act of mutual protection. It was a pact to preserve the mystery, to keep the armor intact, because the armor was all that stood between the myth and the vulnerable man who had built it. They weren't rivals. They were mirrors. And sometimes, the most profound respect lies not in collaboration, but in the conscious, deliberate decision to stay apart, ensuring the reflection remains unbroken.